You wrote about me, did you not? The question stopped my hand halfway through signing my name. I looked up from the literary magazine on the table, and for one impossible second, the crowded bookstore in downtown Boston disappeared. Matthew Reed stood on the other side of the table. 11 years had passed since I had last seen him, but recognition came before thought. The same calm blue eyes. The same habit of tilting his head slightly when waiting for an answer. His dark brown hair was shorter now, touched with gray at the temples, and the years had added faint lines around his eyes. He was 39, though part of my mind stubbornly remembered him at 28, standing beside a whiteboard in room 307. Mr. Reed, I heard myself say. Something softened in his expression. Hello, Ryan. Hearing my name in his voice made my fingers tighten around the pen. I was 28 years old. I had a career in advertising, an apartment I paid for myself, and tonight I had just read my first nationally published short story to nearly 60 strangers without losing my nerve. Yet one hello from my former English teacher had somehow turned me back into the quiet 17-year-old who used to hide behind notebooks. Matthew tapped the open magazine gently. I read it twice. You read my story? I did. He turned several pages until he reached a passage I knew immediately. The fictional teacher in my story was speaking to a student who believed his future had already been decided for him. Matthew read the sentence silently, then looked at me. You do not need permission to become who you are. My heartbeat stumbled. It is just dialogue. Is it? His tone was not accusing. If anything, he sounded amused. Because I remember saying something very similar to a student once. I glanced around the bookstore. The reading had ended 20 minutes earlier. Folding chairs were being stacked near the back wall. Rain tapped softly against the front windows, and only a handful of customers remained. Matthew had apparently waited until almost everyone else was gone before approaching me. You remember that? I asked. I remember more than you probably expect. That answer unsettled me more than it should have. For 11 years, Matthew Reed had existed in my memory as a collection of details I assumed belonged only to me. Blue ink in the margins of my essays, books placed carefully on my desk, encouragement offered when I had almost none for myself. I had eventually learned to call what I felt back then what it was, a teenage crush built around admiration, gratitude, and an idealized version of someone I barely knew outside a classroom. Matthew had never encouraged it. He had been my teacher, nothing more. Then, just before graduation, he disappeared from Westbridge High without giving me the goodbye I had spent days preparing. I had carried that goodbye home inside a sealed envelope. I still had it. Matthew closed the magazine. You kept writing, he said. Eventually. I am glad. For ordinary words, yet something about them reached backward through 11 years. I lowered my eyes to the magazine because looking at him suddenly felt too revealing. Why are you here, Mr. Reed? There was a pause. Matthew, he said gently. I looked up. What? You are 28 now, Ryan. You can call me Matthew. The distance between who we had been and who we were now seemed to shift by an inch. Then he gave me a small smile. As for why I am here, I saw your name on the event announcement. And you decided to come? I almost did not. Why? His eyes rested on mine for a long moment. Because I was not sure seeing me again would be something you wanted. I should have answered immediately. Instead, I stared at the man I had once turned into a perfect memory and realized I knew almost nothing about the person standing in front of me. And somehow, after 11 years, Matthew Reed had come back carrying questions of his own. The sentence Matthew had recognized pulled me backward before I could stop it. 11 years earlier, room 307 had been the only place at Westbridge High where I never watched the clock. I was 17, quiet enough that teachers sometimes marked me absent before noticing me beside the window, and far more comfortable filling notebooks than talking to people. I wrote everywhere, during lunch, on the bus, after midnight when our house was silent. Most of it stayed hidden because showing someone my writing felt like handing them a map to every place I was uncertain about myself. Matthew Reed changed that with an essay assignment in October. We were supposed to write 4 pages about a novel and explain how its main character struggled with identity. I wrote 9. When Matthew returned our papers, mine was covered with blue notes. I assumed I had done something wrong until I reached the final page. Beneath my conclusion, he had written 5 words. You have a voice. Use it. I stared at them until the classroom emptied. Matthew was organizing books behind his desk when he noticed I was still there. Something wrong, Ryan? I carried the essay toward him. Did you mean this? He glanced at his note. I usually mean what I write. Nobody has ever said I was good at this. I did not say you were good. My stomach dropped. Then he smiled slightly. I said you have a voice. Being good takes work. I should have been embarrassed, but instead I laughed. That sounds less inspiring. It is more useful. That became Matthew's way with me. He never offered easy praise. If a paragraph was weak, he told me why. If an idea worked, he made me defend it. He recommended Baldwin, Morrison, Fitzgerald, and writers I had never encountered. Sometimes I stayed after class for 10 minutes to ask about an assignment, a college essay, or a story I was trying to finish. Matthew always kept the classroom door open, and our conversations stayed where they belonged. Books, writing, school, the future. Still, 17-year-old feelings are not famous for respecting logic. Somewhere between autumn and spring, admiration became something more complicated. I started noticing when Matthew wore the navy tie I liked. I remembered jokes he made in class. I replayed compliments long after they should have faded. I knew he was my teacher. I knew nothing could happen, and Matthew never gave me reason to believe otherwise. The feelings were mine alone, private and confusing, so I poured them into notebooks where nobody could see them. Years later, I would understand how much of that crush had been built from gratitude. Matthew had noticed me during a year when I barely knew how to notice myself. At 17, however, gratitude and love seemed separated by a line too thin for me to see. Near the end of senior year, he returned another story I had written. There were corrections everywhere, but at the bottom he had added one sentence. You do not need permission to become who you are. I carried those words with me through college, through rejected stories, through my first advertising job, and eventually into the story Matthew had recognized in Boston. Back in the bookstore, I realized I had been silent too long. Matthew was still standing across from me, patiently waiting. I remember when you said it, I admitted. His expression softened. So do I. I looked at the magazine between us, then at him. That was 11 years ago. Matthew nodded. Some things stay with you. I thought about the old essay stored in a box inside my apartment, the blue handwriting still visible at the bottom of the page. Then another memory surfaced, one I had avoided since the moment Matthew walked into the bookstore, a sealed graduation letter and an empty room, 307. I looked at him and wondered whether he remembered that ending as clearly as he remembered everything else. 3 nights before graduation, I sat at my bedroom desk with a blank sheet of paper and tried to explain a feeling I barely understood. The first version sounded too formal. The second sounded like something I would regret before sunrise. By midnight, crumpled drafts surrounded my chair, and the only sentence I trusted was the simplest one. Thank you for seeing something in me before I could see it myself. I wrote about room 307, the books Matthew had recommended, and the blue notes that had made me take my own writing seriously. Then I admitted something harder. I told him that somewhere during senior year, my admiration had become more personal than I wanted it to be. I did not ask him to return those feelings. Even at 17, I understood that he was my teacher and that the boundary between us mattered. I only wanted to leave Westbridge without pretending that his kindness had meant nothing to me. When I finished, I folded the pages into a plain white envelope and wrote Mr. Reed across the front. For the next 3 days, I carried it in my backpack like a secret with weight. Graduation morning arrived warm and bright. My mother took too many photographs before we left home, and by 10 o'clock the Westbridge football field was crowded with blue gowns, folding chairs, flowers, and families calling to one another across the grass. I kept looking toward the faculty seats. Matthew was not there. At first, I assumed he was late. Then the ceremony started. His chair remained empty. Afterward, while everyone else posed for pictures, I slipped back into the school. The hallways felt strangely hollow without hundreds of students filling them. I climbed the stairs to room 307 with the envelope inside my jacket and rehearsed the same 3 sentences I had practiced all week. Thank you. This is for you. You do not have to answer. The classroom door was open. I stepped inside and stopped. The room had been cleared. The shelves behind Matthew's desk were empty. The framed literary quotations were gone from the walls. His coffee mug had disappeared. Even the stack of battered paperbacks he kept beside the window was missing. Ryan. I turned and saw Mrs. Collins from the English department standing in the hallway. Are you looking for Mr. Reed? Yes. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He is not here today? Her expression became careful. Matthew left yesterday. He accepted another teaching position. I stared at her. Yesterday? It happened quickly. My hand closed around the envelope through my jacket. Did he know he was leaving? Mrs. Collins hesitated for half a second, and that hesitation stayed with me longer than her answer. He had been considering the opportunity for a while. Did he leave anything for me? The question escaped before I could stop it. She looked surprised. For you specifically? No. I nodded as though that did not matter. I thanked her, walked back downstairs, and joined my family outside. In every graduation photograph from that afternoon, the envelope was still hidden inside my jacket. I never mailed it. Weeks became months, months became years, and eventually, I told myself Matthew's disappearance had given me the answer I needed. I went to college. I built a career. I kept writing. The letter followed me through 3 apartments and 11 birthdays, unopened by the only person it had ever been meant for. Now, standing across from Matthew in a Boston bookstore, I realized there was one question I had never stopped carrying with it. He remembered my writing. He remembered his words. He remembered me. So why had he left without saying goodbye? I did not ask Matthew why he had left. Not yet. 11 years had taught me that some questions become heavier when you carry them too long, and I was not ready to drop mine onto a bookstore table between stacks of literary magazines. Matthew seemed to sense that. He glanced toward the front windows, where October rain had turned the Boston sidewalks silver beneath the streetlights. Would you have coffee with me? He asked. I almost laughed at how ordinary the invitation sounded. Coffee. I realize it is not a particularly imaginative suggestion. You used to criticize me for predictable writing. I was hoping you had become more forgiving. 10 minutes later, we were walking 2 blocks through light rain to a small cafe tucked between a pharmacy and an old brick apartment building. Matthew held the door open, and I caught myself remembering him doing the same thing for entire classes at Westbridge. I immediately pushed the memory aside. This was different. We ordered at the counter. Matthew chose black coffee, then added enough sugar to make me raise an eyebrow. What? He asked. Nothing. That was clearly something. I just imagined you drank it black. He smiled. Apparently your fictional version of me is more sophisticated. That made me laugh, and something inside me loosened. We found a table beside the window. For the first 20 minutes, we stayed safely in the present. I told him about working as a copywriter for an advertising agency and writing fiction at night. Matthew explained that he had left classroom teaching several years earlier and now worked as a senior editor for a publishing house in Cambridge. So you still spend your days telling people their paragraphs need work, I said. Now they occasionally thank me for it. I never thanked you. You did, actually. Every time you brought back a better draft. I looked down at my coffee. That was exactly the kind of answer 17-year-old me would have treasured for months. 28-year-old me knew better than to turn kindness into destiny. Still, I felt its warmth. Matthew reached for his cup and nearly knocked the sugar container onto the floor. He caught it awkwardly, muttered something under his breath, and I stared. What? He asked. Nothing. I just do not remember you being clumsy. You only knew me between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. I had a professional reputation to maintain. The image of the flawless teacher in my memory cracked slightly, and unexpectedly, I liked what appeared underneath. Matthew told me he regularly misplaced his keys, had once ruined a houseplant by watering it too much, and could cook exactly 3 respectable dinners. I told him I still wrote after midnight and survived mostly on takeout during deadlines. For the first time, we were not discussing assignments or college applications. We were simply 2 adults learning things about each other. When the rain finally softened, Matthew looked at me thoughtfully. You keep calling me Mr. Reed. I froze. Habit. Matthew, he said. We are a long way from room 307. I tried the name silently before saying it aloud. Matthew. His smile was small but unmistakably warm. Something shifted between us, not into romance, not yet, but away from the roles we had once occupied. Outside, we stopped beneath the cafe awning. Matthew asked whether he could give me his number. I handed him my phone. When he returned it, his name sat on the screen without a title attached. Matthew Reed. I stared at it longer than necessary. Then he said, almost casually, I read your college story too. I looked up sharply. What college story? His expression changed the instant he realized what he had revealed. And suddenly, The question of why Matthew had disappeared was joined by another. How long had he been watching my life from a distance? Matthew's expression told me he wished he could pull the words back, but I had already heard them. What college story? I asked again. Rainwater dripped steadily from the cafe awning behind us, and people passed along the sidewalk carrying umbrellas, but neither of us moved. Matthew slipped his hands into the pockets of his charcoal coat. The one you published during your junior year. The story about the son who keeps returning to an empty train station because he cannot accept that home has changed. I stared at him. That story had appeared in a small university literary journal when I was 20. My mother had read it. A few professors had read it. Almost nobody else knew it existed. How did you find that? Matthew hesitated. Mrs. Collins sent it to me. Why? Because she thought I would want to see it. That answer created more questions than it solved. And did you? Yes. Why? Matthew looked down the street before meeting my eyes again. Because I wanted to know whether you kept writing. The words settled between us. Before I could respond, he glanced toward the subway entrance. I should let you get home. Matthew. He stopped. It was the first time I had used his first name without thinking. Was that the only thing you read? His silence lasted half a second too long. No. Then he left me standing beneath the awning with my phone in one hand, and 11 years of assumptions beginning to rearrange themselves. Over the next week, we exchanged messages cautiously at first, then more naturally. Matthew sent me a photograph of an enormous manuscript on his office desk and complained that one chapter had somehow survived without a single comma. I sent him a picture of my laptop at 1:30 in the morning. He replied, "You still write late." I stared at those 4 words. Still, on Saturday, we met at a used bookstore in Cambridge. Matthew arrived first and was already examining a shelf of American fiction when I found him. How much have you read? I asked instead of saying hello. He turned, clearly unsurprised. Good afternoon to you too. Matthew. He sighed and returned the book in his hand to the shelf. Your university story. 2 pieces you published online after graduation. The essay about working your first advertising job. The short story that was nominated for the New England Fiction Prize 3 years ago. My chest tightened with every title. And the story from last week. Twice. How long have you been doing this? Matthew studied me quietly. Almost from the beginning. I had spent 11 years believing our memories belonged entirely to me. I had remembered room 307, his handwriting, the books, the conversations, and the graduation goodbye that never happened. Meanwhile, somewhere outside my life, Matthew had been watching my name appear beneath stories one publication at a time. Why did you never contact me? I asked. Because staying informed and stepping back into your life were 2 different things. That sounds carefully rehearsed. It probably is. Then give me the unrehearsed answer. Matthew looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since our reunion. I was proud of you, Ryan. My anger softened before I wanted it to. You barely knew me anymore. That did not mean I stopped hoping you would become the person you wanted to be. I looked away, pretending to study the shelves. You remembered me. Of course I remembered you. The answer came so quickly that I turned back. Matthew seemed to realize what he had admitted, but this time he did not retreat from it. You were never as forgettable as you thought you were. Something in my chest shifted. For years, I had built the same explanation around his disappearance. I had cared too much, and he had cared too little. Now that explanation was falling apart. If Matthew had remembered me, followed my writing, and quietly celebrated my progress for 11 years, then his disappearance from Westbridge could not have meant what I thought it meant. I looked at him across the narrow bookstore aisle and finally understood that I had been asking the wrong question. It was no longer whether Matthew remembered me. It was why someone who remembered so much had chosen to leave. The question stayed with me for 3 days before I finally stopped pretending I could ignore it. I still had Mrs. Collins's email address from a Westbridge alumni newsletter my mother forwarded every year, so on Tuesday morning I wrote to her. I kept the message simple. I told her I had recently seen Matthew again and asked whether she remembered why he had left so suddenly before my graduation. Her reply arrived that afternoon. She asked if we could speak by phone. That alone told me the answer would not be simple. I called her after work and stood beside my apartment window while Boston traffic moved below me. Mrs. Collins sounded almost exactly as I remembered, warm and careful with every sentence. Matthew had already received another job offer that spring, she explained. He had been considering it for weeks. Then why did he leave before graduation? There was a pause. Ryan, there is something you should understand before I answer. You did nothing wrong. My hand tightened around the phone. Why would you say that? Because Matthew was concerned about you. She told me that near the end of senior year, Matthew had noticed how much I depended on his approval. I stayed after class frequently. I brought him nearly everything I wrote. If he praised something, I believed in it. If he questioned it, I questioned myself. He had also begun to suspect that my admiration for him had become a teenage crush. I closed my eyes. 11 years disappeared in an instant. He knew. He suspected. He never claimed to know exactly what you felt. Mrs. Collins continued carefully. He asked me for advice because he wanted to make sure he handled the situation appropriately. He was very clear that maintaining boundaries was his responsibility as the adult and as your teacher. I sat down slowly on the edge of my couch. So he took the other job because of me. Not because of you, she corrected. The opportunity already existed. Your graduation was approaching, and Matthew decided accepting it would create a clean transition. He believed some distance would help you stop measuring yourself through his approval. I thought about the empty shelves in room 307. He could have said goodbye. Yes, she said softly. I told him that too. That surprised me. You disagreed with him? I thought disappearing might leave. Questions. Matthew thought a personal goodbye could make things more confusing for you. He chose what he believed was the more responsible option. For 11 years, I had interpreted his absence as indifference. I had imagined myself as one student among hundreds, easily forgotten the moment he packed his books. But Matthew had not forgotten me. He had stepped away deliberately. The realization did not erase the hurt. Somehow, it made it more complicated. Why did you send him my college story? I asked. Mrs. Collins laughed quietly. Because 2 years later, you published something, and I knew he would be proud. Was he? He called me the same day. I looked toward the box beneath my desk where the old graduation letter still rested. What did he say? Another pause. He said, I knew he would keep going. After we ended the call, I remained on the couch for a long time. My phone lay beside me with Matthew's name near the top of my recent messages. The story I had believed for 11 years was gone. He had not left because I meant nothing. He had left partly because he believed caring responsibly meant creating distance. I understood the intention now, but one question still burned beneath everything else. If Matthew had spent 11 years keeping that distance, why had he chosen to cross it now? I opened our messages and typed before I could reconsider. I know why you left Westbridge. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, vanished, then returned. Finally, his answer arrived. I wondered when you would find out. I stared at the screen and typed one more sentence. Then tell me the part Mrs. Collins could not. Matthew asked me to meet him the next evening beside the Charles River, near a quiet stretch of walkway where the city lights reflected across the dark water. The October air had turned colder, and by the time I saw him waiting near the railing, I had rehearsed the conversation so many times that every version sounded wrong. Matthew looked at me as I approached. Mrs. Collins told you everything she knew. She told me enough. He nodded slowly, then asked me what you came to ask. I stopped several feet from him. You knew how I felt. Matthew did not look away. I suspected. And you left. Yes. The answer was so direct that it irritated me more than an excuse would have. Do you know what I thought for 11 years? I asked. I thought I had imagined everything that mattered. I thought I was just another student you forgot the moment you emptied your desk. Matthew's expression tightened with regret. You were never forgettable, Ryan. Then why did you not say goodbye? For a moment, only the sound of traffic across the river filled the silence. Because you were 17, he said. And because I was responsible for making sure my choices did not make your feelings more confusing. You could have told me you were leaving. I could have. His voice softened. That is the part one got wrong. I had expected him to defend himself. Hearing him admit it took some of the anger out of me. I thought a private goodbye might make you believe there was something between us that could continue after graduation, Matthew said. There was not. I was your teacher. You were my student. Whatever you were feeling, I did not want you to think it was shameful, and I did not want to encourage it either. I looked down at the pavement. So disappearing seemed kinder? At the time, yes. And now? Matthew gave a tired smile. Now I think responsible decisions can still hurt people when they are made without giving them any explanation. I turned toward the river. For years, I had wanted an answer that would make the past simple. Instead, Matthew had given me one that made him human. He had tried to do the right thing, and still made a mistake. Why did you keep reading my work? I asked. Because I wanted to know whether you kept going. For 11 years? At first, yes. I turned back. At first. Matthew took a breath. Later, your writing stopped being something I read because you had once been my student. I started reading because I liked the person I could hear in those pages. Your humor. Your stubbornness. The way you noticed lonely people. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to stay in the present. Matthew, what are you saying? He stepped no closer. I am saying that I knew a 17-year-old student named Ryan Parker. I cared about his future because I was his teacher. Nothing more happened between us, and nothing should have. His eyes held mine. But the man standing in front of me now is 28. He has built a career, published his own work, and apparently still writes endings I disagree with. Despite everything, I laughed. Matthew smiled briefly. I am only beginning to know that man. And you want to? His expression became serious again. Yes, but only if he wants me to. The difference hit me then. At 17, there had been no choice to make. There should not have been one. Now there was. I want that too, I said. Matthew released a breath as though he had been holding it for 11 years. I reached into my coat pocket, feeling suddenly certain about what needed to happen next. There is something you should read. What? I looked at him and thought of the sealed envelope waiting in the box beneath my desk. The goodbye I never got to give you. The envelope looked smaller than I remembered. An hour after leaving the river, Matthew stood inside my Boston apartment while I opened the box beneath my desk and searched through old notebooks, college papers, and photographs I had not touched in years. When I finally found it, the white paper had faded slightly around the edges, but my 17-year-old handwriting was still clear across the front. Mr. Reed. I carried it into the living room and held it out to him. Matthew stared at the envelope without taking it. You kept it all this time? 11 years. Ryan, you do not have to give me this. I know. That was exactly why I finally could. He accepted it carefully. Are you sure? Read it. Matthew sat near the window while I remained standing, suddenly unable to decide what to do with my hands. He opened the envelope and unfolded the pages. Watching him read words written by the boy I used to be felt stranger than I expected. I remembered that boy so clearly. Uncertain, hopeful, convinced that being understood by one person meant that person must be extraordinary. Matthew read without interrupting. When he reached the final page, his expression softened. He folded the letter along its old creases and looked up. I am sorry you carried this alone. I am not. He seemed surprised. I sat across from him. For years, I thought that letter was proof that I had missed some great chance. Like if I had given it to you, everything might have been different. It could not have been different, Matthew said gently. I know. I smiled faintly. That is what took me 11 years to understand. I took the envelope back and turned it over in my hands. The boy who wrote this thought he loved you. Matthew remained silent. But he did not know you, I continued. He knew the teacher who encouraged him. The man who wrote good notes on his essays and recommended books and made him feel visible. He turned that person into something perfect. Matthew gave a quiet laugh. You have definitely learned better since then. Absolutely. You use too much sugar in your coffee. You lose your keys. You overwater plants. And you apparently read everything I publish without telling me. My reputation has suffered considerably. I laughed, and the tension in the room finally broke. Then I looked at him again. That is the point. I know more about you now than I ever did then, and I still want to know more. Matthew's smile faded into something quieter. Ryan, I am not trying to finish what I started at 17. I placed the old letter on the table between us. That story ended a long time ago. Then what are you saying? I stood and moved closer, stopping with enough space between us that neither of us could mistake the moment for anything but a choice. I am saying I am beginning to fall for the person you are now. Matthew searched my face. He did not reach for me. Are you sure? I thought about room 307, the empty classroom, 11 years of unanswered questions, and the man standing before me who was no longer an idea preserved in memory. For the first time, I said, yes. Matthew hesitated, then asked quietly, may I kiss you? The question mattered more than the kiss itself. Yes. He leaned closer, and our first kiss was brief, gentle, and entirely ours. No classroom, no old roles, no teenage fantasy pretending to be a future. When we stepped apart, Matthew smiled with a kind of nervousness I had never imagined him capable of. I looked down at the letter on the table and realized it no longer felt unfinished. It had finally reached the person it was written for, only to prove that neither of us needed to live inside it anymore. 4 months later, Matthew sat at my kitchen table with a red pen in one hand and 300 pages of my unfinished novel spread around him like evidence in a very literary crime scene. Spring had finally reached Boston, and warm afternoon light came through the open window while traffic hummed several floors below. "You cannot keep doing this," Matthew said. I looked over from the coffee maker. "Doing what?" "Introducing perfectly interesting characters and then making them miserable for 200 pages. Conflict is important. So is happiness. You are an editor. You are supposed to respect artistic suffering. I respect punctuation. Everything else is negotiable." I laughed and carried our coffee to the table. 4 months had taught me more about Matthew than 11 years of memory ever had. He was patient with manuscripts and impatient with slow elevators. He owned 6 nearly identical charcoal sweaters. He forgot where he put his glasses at least twice a week. He still drank coffee with an unreasonable amount of sugar. He had also learned things about me. I became quiet when deadlines frightened me. I reorganized bookshelves instead of admitting I was stuck on a chapter. I needed someone to tell me when an idea was weak, but I no longer needed that person to tell me whether I was good enough. That difference mattered. We had taken everything slowly. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became weekends at used bookstores, walks along the Charles, and evenings spent arguing about novels in my apartment. We never pretended our history had been a secret romance waiting 11 years for permission to continue. There had been no romance then. Matthew had been my teacher, and I had been a teenager trying to understand admiration, gratitude, and my first complicated feelings. What we had now had begun only after we met again as adults. "You missed a page," Matthew said. "Impossible. Page 186. I sat beside him and pulled the manuscript closer. Near the bottom of the page, beneath one of my paragraphs, Matthew had written something in blue ink instead of red. "You have a voice. Use it." I stopped breathing for half a second. Room 307 returned to me with impossible clarity. Fluorescent lights, scratched desks, my 17-year-old hands holding an essay, and 5 words that had once seemed powerful enough to change my entire future. Then I noticed another sentence beneath them. "And let me hear it this time." I looked at Matthew. "You planned this." "I have no idea what you mean." "You switched pens." "Circumstantial evidence." I smiled, but my eyes stayed on those words. "When you first wrote that, I thought you were giving me permission to become a writer." Matthew's expression softened. "And now I know I never needed permission." He nodded. "Good." I touched the edge of the manuscript. "You just helped me notice something that was already there." Matthew reached across the table and took my hand. The gesture was ordinary now, and that was what made it beautiful. I had spent so many years believing love was supposed to feel like longing for someone just beyond reach. I knew better now. Love could look like coffee cooling beside an unfinished manuscript. It could sound like disagreement over an ending. It could be 2 people who knew each other's flaws and stayed curious anyway. At 17, I thought loving Matthew meant wanting him to choose me. At 28, I finally understood that growing up had given me something far more important, the freedom to choose for myself. I looked at the man beside me, then at the unfinished pages waiting on the table, and smiled. For once, I was not afraid of how the story would end.